She tried not to stare. Everything she had ever been taught, every warning from her superiors, every fear that had kept her alive for months, screamed at her to look away. But she couldn't. The air in the cold, dimly lit POW camp was thick with tension, a palpable silence interrupted only by the distant echoes of artillery fading into the horizon. It was late 1945, a time when the world was still reeling from the aftermath of a war that had reshaped nations and shattered lives. The barracks were worn, the walls stained with the remnants of despair and hopelessness, and the ground beneath her feet was a muddy testament to the harshness of life in captivity. Frieda Weber stood in line, her heart pounding against her chest, each beat a reminder of the conflicting emotions that surged within her. At 24, she was a nurse, a caregiver trained to heal, yet here she was, a prisoner of war, caught in the crosshairs of her own indoctrination. The memories of her upbringing in Nazi Germany flooded her mind, the propaganda that painted the British as ruthless monsters, the tales of heroism that had filled her childhood. She had always believed that she was on the side of righteousness, that her sacrifices were for a greater cause. But now, as she awaited her first meal with the very soldiers she had been taught to despise, uncertainty gnawed at her soul. She glanced around, her eyes darting between the other prisoners, their expressions a mix of fear, resignation, and curiosity. The line moved slowly, dragging out the tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Each step brought her closer to the unknown, an encounter that could shatter her perceptions and redefine her reality. As she approached the serving table, she caught a glimpse of the British soldiers. Their uniforms were mud-streaked, their faces weary from the long months of conflict, but their eyes held a spark of something she hadn't anticipated: humanity. Tommy Hughes, a young soldier, stood behind the table, his hands trembling slightly as he ladled food onto the plates. He was nervous, yet a flicker of compassion shone through the apprehension. He caught Frieda's gaze and offered a tentative smile, a gesture that sent a jolt through her. Could this be the monster she had been warned about? The moment hung suspended in time, her mind racing with confusion. She remembered the stories of brutality, of soldiers who had committed unspeakable acts in the name of victory. How could she reconcile this image of kindness with the horrors she had been raised to expect? The internal battle raged on, a tumult of fear and curiosity intertwining like a twisted vine. This single moment would redefine her entire world, she thought, grappling with the weight of uncertainty. Before we uncover why, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now back to 1945. As Frieda took her plate, their hands brushed momentarily, and a rush of warmth flooded her system. It was a simple touch, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. She wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of her ingrained beliefs, but something held her in place. Around her, the atmosphere was charged with an unusual blend of tension and curiosity. Other soldiers gathered, exchanging glances, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and compassion. Sergeant McAllister, a hardened veteran with a face carved by years of conflict, stood nearby. He watched the exchange with a wary eye, his brow furrowed as he assessed the situation. He believed they were merely prisoners, a threat to be contained, yet beneath his tough exterior lay a flicker of empathy. Frieda's thoughts spiraled as she took a seat at one of the makeshift tables, her hands trembling slightly around the edges of her plate. The food was simple, stew and bread, but the aroma wafting through the air was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the bland rations she had grown accustomed to. Yet even as she served herself, she couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger, the fear that this kindness was merely a facade. The British soldiers began to converse, their laughter breaking through the tension like sunlight piercing through heavy clouds. It was a sound she had been told to despise, yet it resonated within her, tugging at the edges of her rigid beliefs. She listened intently, each chuckle and playful banter making her question everything she had been taught. This couldn't be right. These were the monsters, weren't they? Frieda's mind raced with disbelief as she struggled to reconcile her lifelong convictions with the reality before her. The soldiers were not the caricatures of evil she had been led to believe. They were human beings, bearing the scars of war just as she did. She looked down at her food, swallowed hard and took a breath. The warmth of the stew filled her with a conflicting sense of comfort and dread. Could she allow herself to accept this moment, to embrace the humanity she saw reflected in their eyes? The dissonance swirled around her, a storm of thoughts battling for dominance. As she sat there, enveloped in the strange camaraderie forming around her, she felt an unexpected connection, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of her beliefs. The moment was both terrifying and exhilarating, a step into the unknown that she hadn't anticipated. Frida's heart raced and she felt a strange pull towards the soldiers, particularly Tommy, whose kind gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that both frightened and intrigued her. She was caught in a web of emotions, each strand pulling her in different directions, challenging her to rethink her understanding of the world and her place within it. The air was thick with the aroma of stew and the sound of laughter, but within her a quiet storm raged on, preparing her for the transformation that was about to unfold. It was a moment that would change everything, a moment that demanded she confront the very essence of her beliefs and the humanity she had long denied. In that cold, dimly lit POW camp, with the shadows of the past looming large, Frida Weber stood on the precipice of a new reality, a reality that would force her to navigate the complexities of war, humanity, and the painful journey of self-discovery. Frida stood in line, her heart racing as the cold air bit through her thin clothing. Each breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of her fears and the suffocating grip of uncertainty. She could hear the low murmur of voices around her, a strange combination of laughter and gruff commands. The British soldiers, she thought, were supposed to be the enemy. Yet here they were, discussing their rations with an ease that seemed almost foreign to her. The camp, located in the rolling countryside of England, was a far cry from the battlefield she had known. It was a place of confinement, but also a strange sanctuary where former enemies shared the same ground. The makeshift tents and barbed wire created an unsettling atmosphere of enforced civility. Only a few weeks had passed since she had been taken prisoner. The memories of her capture still haunted her. The chaos of the battlefield, the shouts of commanders, the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled her as she was marched into captivity. Frida couldn't shake the whispers of doubt that echoed in her mind. Was she going to face brutality at the hands of those she had been taught to despise? The tales of mistreatment she had heard from other women in the camp played like a broken record, each repetition stirring her anxiety. She clenched her fists, feeling the rough fabric of her uniform against her palms. What if they decide to take their frustrations out on me? She thought. What if I am nothing but a target for their revenge? Her thoughts raced back to her life in Germany, where loyalty to the fatherland was paramount. Raised in a household steeped in Nazi ideology, she had been taught that the British were barbarians, that they were a threat to her very existence. Her father had been a fervent supporter of the regime, his beliefs instilled in her from a young age. She remembered the pride she felt when she first donned the nurse's uniform, believing she was serving a cause that was just. Yet, as the war dragged on, the disillusionment had seeped into her consciousness like poison. She had seen the destruction wrought by the war, the suffering of both her people and those of the countries they invaded. As the tide turned against Germany, doubts crept in. She had begun to question everything she had been raised to believe. The propaganda that once filled her with pride now felt like a shackle, binding her to a narrative that no longer resonated with her heart. "Why are we here?" she had asked a fellow nurse during those final days before her capture. "Are we really doing the right thing?" The other woman had laughed bitterly, her eyes filled with a mix of despair and resignation. "It's too late to question it now, Frida. We're all just pieces on a chessboard and the game is rigged." The line shuffled forward, breaking her reverie. As she stepped closer to the serving table, she caught sight of Tommy Hughes. He stood behind the table, his youthful face framed by the standard-issue helmet, his eyes betraying a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. He was one of the younger soldiers, maybe in his early 20s, and he seemed to radiate a warmth that was unexpected in this cold environment. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice tinged with an accent that made her feel both alienated and intrigued. "We've got stew if you can stomach it." Frida's stomach growled in response, but she felt a strange knot of apprehension tighten within her. What is this? She thought. A trick, a taunt. She could see the other soldiers watching her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. This was not the savage enemy she had been led to believe existed. "Go on, it's just food," Tommy encouraged, his eyes softening as he offered her a bowl filled with steaming stew. The aroma wafted through the air, rich and inviting. Frida hesitated, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Part of her wanted to reach out and take the bowl, to experience this unexpected kindness. Yet another part of her screamed to withdraw, to retreat into the safety of her preconceived notions. "Just take it," he said gently, as if sensing her internal struggle. "We're not your enemy anymore." A flicker of humanity shone in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, Frida felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. What would you do in her shoes? She thought, recalling the phrase as if it were spoken aloud. Would you trust them? Suddenly, the tension in the air felt almost palpable as she took a step closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the bowl. Tommy smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. It was a smile she had never expected from someone she had been taught to view as a monster. As she turned to find a place to sit, she overheard a group of soldiers sharing a laugh. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, held up a photograph. "Look at this lot," he exclaimed, showing a picture of his children. "They're waiting for me to come home." Frida's heart sank. The image of a family, innocent and untouched by the horrors of war, struck a chord deep within her. These men have lives outside of this camp, she thought. Families who love them. The realization was like a cold wave washing over her, forcing her to confront the humanity she had been taught to overlook. The sounds of laughter, the smell of stew, and the warmth of Tommy's smile began to dissolve the icy fortress she had built around her heart. She felt a flicker of curiosity, a desire to bridge the chasm that had separated them for so long. As she sat down on the bench, surrounded by the men who had once been her enemies, Frida could feel her pulse quickening. "What am I doing?" she thought, her mind racing with the implications of this moment. "I'm sitting with the enemy, sharing a meal. What will happen next?" The tension in her chest shifted to something almost electric, a mix of fear, uncertainty, and a sliver of hope. Frida glanced at Tommy, who was engaged in conversation with the other men, his laughter ringing out like music in the air. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the stew seep through the bowl and into her hands. Perhaps this is a step towards something new, she thought, her heart pounding in her chest. Perhaps there is more to them than I have been led to believe. As she began to eat, a new thought emerged. What if we all could see each other as more than just soldiers on opposing sides? The question lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. Before she could fully process these thoughts, a voice broke through her reverie. "Hey, you all right?" It was Tommy again, concern etched on his features. "You seem a bit distant." Frida met his gaze, and in that moment, she felt the weight of her upbringing clash against the reality before her. How could I ever explain the contradictions in my mind? She wondered, feeling a mix of vulnerability and strength. Taking a leap of faith, she responded, "I'm trying to understand what's happening here." "Join the club," Tommy replied with a chuckle, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "We're all just trying to make sense of this mess." For the first time since her capture, Frida felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could be the beginning of a different narrative, a chance to redefine the meaning of humanity in the aftermath of war. As the meal continued, laughter echoed around her, and for the first time, she felt a sense of belonging amidst the chaos. What would you do in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below. If you're intrigued by Frida's journey and want to follow her story and others like it, consider subscribing to our channel. Join us as we explore the rich tapestry of history, weaving together tales of humanity, empathy, and transformation. Your support helps us bring these stories to light, reminding us that behind every uniform, there are people just like us. Thank you for watching. The air felt electric as Frida Weber stepped into the makeshift dining area. The dim light flickered above, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the British soldiers seated at the long, battered table. She was acutely aware of the eyes upon her, some curious, others cautious, and a few hardened by the horrors they had witnessed. Clenching the edges of her tattered uniform, she forced herself to breathe, each inhalation heavy with the scent of unidentifiable food that mingled with the stale odor of sweat and fatigue. "Come on, Frida. It's just a meal," she whispered to herself, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She could feel the weight of her upbringing, a lifetime of indoctrination to hate the enemy, bearing down on her, an anchor in a storm of doubt. As she took her seat at the table, her eyes flitted from one soldier to another. Tommy Hughes, the young man who had been so kind to her during her initial days in captivity, was seated directly across from her. His face bore a mixture of nervousness and determination, and as their eyes met, he offered a tentative smile. It was a smile that spoke of hope, but also of uncertainty, as if he, too, was grappling with the uncharted territory of their shared humanity. "This is your first meal with us, isn't it?" he asked, his voice warm but tinged with an undercurrent of caution. "I hope it's not too terrible." Frida nodded, unable to find her voice. Instead, she focused on the plate in front of her, a haphazard pile of food that resembled a meager attempt at sustenance. The soldiers around her chatted in a mix of jovial banter and muted conversation, their laughter a strange melody that seemed to clash with the atmosphere of despair surrounding them. Suddenly, the door swung open with a creak, and Sergeant McAllister strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent, the camaraderie abruptly replaced with a tension that crackled in the air. His gaze swept over the soldiers before landing on Frida, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. "Right, listen up," he barked, his voice reverberating against the walls. "We're not here to coddle the enemy. Remember who you're dealing with." His words cut through the room like a knife, sending a shiver of apprehension down Frida's spine. She fought the urge to shrink into herself, but Tommy's hand moved subtly across the table, finding hers. It was a small gesture, yet it ignited a warmth in her that sharply contrasted with the coldness of McAllister's tone. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of rebellion against the sergeant's harshness. "Don't mind him," Tommy whispered, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "He's seen too much, we all have." The sincerity in his voice was like a balm to her frayed nerves. As the meal commenced, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Frida found herself drawn into the conversation, her initial fear slowly melting away as the soldiers shared stories of their lives before the war, tales of love, loss, and dreams shattered. She listened intently, her heart aching as she realized that these were not the monsters she had been taught to fear. They were men, just like the ones she had known back home, full of laughter and longing. Then, as if sensing the fragile bond forming, Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin of chocolate. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "It's not much, but it's sweet. I thought you might like some." Frida's breath caught in her throat. The simple act of sharing food, an intimate gesture laden with meaning, struck her profoundly. "You don't have to," she protested weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just chocolate, Frida. Enjoy it," Tommy insisted, his eyes sparkling with kindness. As she took the tin from him, their fingers brushed and a jolt of electricity coursed through her. She could hardly comprehend what was happening. These were the soldiers she had been taught to demonize, yet here was one showing her an unexpected kindness. She opened the tin, and the rich, sweet aroma wafted up, enveloping her senses. Hesitantly, she took a piece and popped it into her mouth. For a moment, the world around her faded, leaving only the taste of chocolate, smooth, sweet, and utterly divine. As she savored it, she watched the soldiers around her, their faces alight with laughter and camaraderie. But then, the laughter faded abruptly, as McAllister's voice cut through the air once more. "You lot need to remember what's at stake here. They're not our friends. They're the enemy, and we can't let our guard down." Frida's heart sank. The warmth she had begun to feel dissipated under the sergeant's harsh glare. She could see the conflict in Tommy's eyes, a mix of loyalty to his commanding officer and the burgeoning friendship he had begun to forge with her. "Okay," McAllister said, his tone softening slightly as he turned to her. "Let's not pretend it's all sweetness and light. You're still a POW and we're still at war, don't forget that. Frida felt the weight of his words settle upon her like a heavy mantle. She had thought for a moment that the barriers could be torn down, that humanity could bridge the chasm of enmity between them. But here it was, stark and unyielding. As the meal continued, Frida struggled to reconcile the kindness she had experienced with the harsh reality of her situation. She caught glimpses of Tommy stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. It was as if he wanted to tell her that not all soldiers were like McAllister, that there were still fragments of humanity left amidst the rubble of war. The meal drew to a close, and as the soldiers began to disperse, Frida felt a sense of loss. The warmth of the shared experience was overshadowed by the looming specter of their circumstances. She stood, feeling as if she were about to shatter under the weight of her conflicting emotions. "Frida," Tommy called, his voice breaking through her turmoil. She turned to him, her heart racing. Can we talk later?" he asked, his expression earnest. She nodded, a flicker of hope igniting within her. But then McAllister's voice interrupted again, cold and unyielding. "Hughes, focus on your duties. No time for chit-chat with the enemy." Frida's heart sank. She felt the chasm between them widen as she watched Tommy's shoulders slump, his hope extinguished under the sergeant's command. As the soldiers filed out, Frida remained seated, her mind swirling with confusion and a burgeoning sense of betrayal. How could they treat her as both a human being and an enemy? Then, just as she was about to leave, McAllister paused, turning back to her with a piercing gaze. "Remember, Weber, you're not one of us. The moment you forget, that is the moment you lose your life." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Frida felt her heart plummet. Just as she thought she had found a glimmer of connection, the harsh truth of her reality crashed down upon her. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. Frida stepped into the fading light, her heart heavy with the weight of her revelations. She had tasted kindness amidst cruelty, warmth amidst the coldness of war, and yet the specter of her indoctrination loomed large. In that moment, she realized the profound truth. The enemy was not simply a faceless entity to be despised. They were men with families, fears, and dreams. But as she walked away, the shadows of doubt lingered in her mind. It was a truth that would haunt her, a revelation that would challenge everything she had ever known. The question echoed in her heart. How could she reconcile this new reality with the hatred she had been taught to believe? As she lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, the words of McAllister echoed in her mind. "You're not one of us." But in her heart, she felt an undeniable pull towards the humanity she had witnessed, the light piercing through the darkness of war. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and she would have to confront the demons of her past. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She never expected this, a moment that would forever alter her perception, a chance to redefine what it meant to be human amidst the ruins of hatred. As the days unfolded after that fateful meal, Frida Weber found herself walking through the muddy paths of the POW camp with a newfound sense of purpose and curiosity. The initial shock of her encounter with the British soldiers had ignited a spark within her, a desire to understand rather than fear, to connect rather than distance herself. It was a gradual shift, one that required her to confront the deep-seated beliefs she had clung to for so long. Frida began to observe her captors more closely. She watched as they engaged in mundane tasks, laughing and joking with one another, their camaraderie a stark contrast to the isolation she had felt. Each interaction chipped away at the wall of hostility she had built around herself. Tommy Hughes, the soldier who had shared his rations with her, became a bridge between their worlds. Every day, he would seek her out, offering her small gestures of kindness, a piece of chocolate, a warm smile, or a reassuring word. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a gentle light over the camp, Frida found herself sitting beside Tommy on a makeshift bench. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, a rare treat in the camp. They spoke of their lives before the war, exchanging stories that revealed the humanity they both shared. Frida learned about Tommy's family, his dreams of becoming a teacher, and his love for nature. In return, she shared tales of her childhood, of laughter and warmth, and of the naive confidence that had once led her to believe in the righteousness of her cause. With each conversation, Frida felt the barriers of her upbringing begin to crumble. She started to question the narratives that had been instilled in her, the relentless propaganda that painted the British as monsters, the fear that had dictated her actions. The realization hit her with a force she could not ignore. These soldiers were not the faceless enemy she had been taught to despise. They were individuals, each with their own stories, hopes, and fears. In her quiet moments, Frida reflected on the weight of the past. She thought about her family back in Germany and the values they had upheld. The shame she felt for her previous beliefs mingled with a sense of liberation. It was as if she was shedding a skin that had suffocated her for too long. For the first time, she understood the power of empathy, the importance of seeing beyond uniforms and ideologies. As the weeks progressed, a tentative friendship blossomed between Frida and the soldiers. She began to help them with small tasks, using her nursing skills to treat minor injuries and ailments. The soldiers welcomed her assistance, and in those moments, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for so long. The laughter that echoed through the barracks became a balm for her spirit, healing the wounds that war had inflicted on her soul. Yet her transformation was not without its challenges. The specter of her past loomed large, and the guilt of having once harbored hate weighed heavily on her conscience. She often found herself wrestling with the memories of her upbringing, the voices of her family echoing in her mind. How could I have believed those things? She would ask herself, tears of confusion streaming down her face. But with each passing day, she learned to forgive herself, to acknowledge her humanity and the capacity for change that lay within her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the camp, Frida gathered the courage to approach Sergeant McAllister. He had been distant, a man hardened by the war, but she sensed a flicker of curiosity behind his stern exterior. "Sir," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know I'm a prisoner, and perhaps I do not have the right to speak, but I wish to say thank you. You and your men have shown me kindness when I expected none. It has changed me." The sergeant looked at her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he nodded, a hint of softness breaking through his stoic facade. "We all have our battles, Frida. It takes courage to see beyond what we've been taught." His words resonated within her, affirming the path she had chosen. As winter began to approach, the atmosphere in the camp shifted once more. The war had come to an end, and the soldiers were preparing to return home. The news filled Frida with a mix of joy and sorrow. She was happy for them, but acutely aware of the void their absence would create in her life. The friendships she had forged had become a lifeline, a reminder that humanity could thrive even in the darkest of circumstances. On the last day before the soldiers were to depart, Frida gathered her courage and approached Tommy, a bittersweet smile on her face. "Will you promise to remember me?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I do not want to fade from your memory." Tommy's eyes softened, and he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I will never forget you, Frida. You've shown me that there's more to this world than hate and war. You're a part of my story now." With that, they exchanged contact information, a promise of connection that would transcend borders and time. As they said their goodbyes, Frida felt a profound sense of resolution. She had come to understand that her identity was not defined by the uniform she had once worn or the beliefs she had been raised with. She was a human being capable of growth, capable of love, and capable of change. In the months that followed, Frida found herself at a crossroads. With the war over, she faced the daunting reality of rebuilding her life. The memories of the camp and the soldiers stayed with her, guiding her as she navigated the complexities of her past and future. She returned to Germany, where she found her family had been irrevocably changed, their beliefs shattered by the realities of war. Frida made it her mission to share her experiences, to speak out against the dehumanization that had consumed so many during the war. She became involved in community efforts aimed at fostering understanding and reconciliation between former enemies. Her story became a beacon of hope, illustrating the power of empathy, and the impact of personal connection in a world divided by conflict. Years later, as she stood before an audience, sharing her journey of transformation, she recalled the simple act of kindness that had changed everything. "It was a meal shared between enemies that taught me the greatest lesson of my life," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We are all more alike than we are different, and it is our capacity for empathy that will heal the wounds of our past." As the applause filled the room, Frida felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had turned her pain into purpose, her fear into understanding. The echoes of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the aftermath of destruction, hope could flourish. Stories like Frida's remind us that behind the uniforms, the flags, and the ideologies, there are always human beings. They remind us that our capacity for empathy is the most powerful weapon against hatred. If you believe that these forgotten histories need to be told, that we must learn from them to build a better future, then join our community of history lovers by subscribing to the channel. Help us continue to bring these vital stories out of the shadows. Thank you for watching.